Welcome back. I'm Eddie Muller. I hope you enjoyed spending the last month of summer with all those brightly shining stars, but I suspect you're ready to once again fall into the darkness and despair of Noir Alley. To get us off to a sinister and suspenseful start, I've got one of the best films of the genre. From Paramount Pictures in 1948, it's The Big Clock. Now, one of the most unusual things about this film is that it's based on a 1946 novel that got stellar reviews upon publication, which is rare for mystery novels back then. Even more rare, a book so highly regarded being turned into a movie that got equally great reviews. With The Big Clock, no one argues which is better, the book or the movie, because they're both terrific. What makes The Big Clock irresistible is its ingenious premise. George Stroud, the editor of Crime Ways magazine, has a dalliance with his boss's girlfriend. When she turns up dead, Stroud realizes he was the last person to see her alive, and that he saw the killer. His boss, publishing magnate Earl Janoth, put Stroud in charge of the investigation. And it's a race against time as Stroud hunts the real killer while evidence mounts framing him as the culprit. The hunter is also the hunted. Now, if this sounds familiar, author Kenneth Fearing borrowed the idea from Sam Fuller's 1944 novel The Dark Page, made in 1952 as Scandal Sheet. Now, it's such a good hook, I borrowed it for my first novel, The Distance. And Hollywood recycled it in 1987, moving the action to Washington, D.C. for a remake called No Way Out. Now, the nation's capital certainly is a viper's nest, but it has nothing on the story's original setting, the New York publishing world of the 1940s, a place Kenneth Fearing knew well. He was an unlikely writer of crime and mystery yarns, even if he was a police reporter in Chicago in the 1920s. His fiction career started with racy stories for pulp magazines like Tattletales and Paris Nights. But during the 30s, Fearing developed into one of the nation's foremost poets, evoking Depression-era America more vividly than anyone. His colleague, Kenneth Rexroth, said, "No other poet of the time so closely identified himself with the working class, with the impoverished stratum of the underworld, with hustlers, grifters, nifties, yeggs, and thirsties, and no one else so completely immersed himself in the lingo of the mass culture." Reading Fearing's urgent poetry, he said, was like a taxi driver reading a billboard while fighting traffic. Now, in addition to penning poetry, Fearing was the regular film critic for New Masses, a Marxist magazine associated with the Communist Party of the United States. He described his readers as genuine dyed-in-the-wool movie hopheads. And while he claimed Hollywood's dream powder was the lowest form of opiate on earth, Fearing admitted he couldn't get enough of it. He also worked briefly for Time magazine, crown jewel in the media empire of legendary publisher Henry Luce, a devout Christian and anti-communist whose self-proclaimed mission was to spread democracy and open markets worldwide. In the early 40s, when Fearing was one of his minions, Luce gave his media empire a black eye by openly supporting Benito Mussolini's fascist government in Italy and downplaying in print Hitler's threat to our European allies. So it was no surprise when Luce and his media empire became grist for Kenneth Fearing's imagination. The antagonist of The Big Clock, Earl Janoth, was Fearing's caricature of Luce, and Charles Laughton had a field day portraying this larger-than-life megalomaniac. He makes Janoth one of the most unique villains in noir, the genre's diabolical version of Charles Foster Kane. As his foil, Ray Milland is perfectly cast as George Stroud. Since Cary Grant never made a full-on noir, Milland is as close as will come. It's a squirmy pleasure to watch this suave actor coming apart at the seams as the walls close in, but still have the stuff to go toe-to-toe with Laughton in a razor-sharp game of cat and mouse. And that a drunken bender triggers our hero's problems was a wink and a nudge for 1948 audiences. Milland's Oscar-winning performance in The Lost Weekend was still fresh in their minds. Now, the film's high noir visual style comes courtesy of director John Farrow, a one-time screenwriter who in the mid-40s sharply honed his directorial style, especially in noir's shadowy terrain. He's abetted by Paramount's maestro of the dark, John F. Seitz, who'd previously shot a couple of noir landmarks, 1942's This Gun for Hire and the definitive Double Indemnity in 1944, as well as The Lost Weekend in 45 and Farrow's darkly exotic Calcutta in 47. And special mention must be paid to art directors Roland Anderson, Albert Nozaki, and the head of Paramount's art department, Hans Dreyer, for the creation of the big clock that's used dramatically in the film. In Fearing's novel, the big clock is only a metaphor, like Raymond Chandler calling his first novel The Big Sleep. In fact, the title is a direct reference to Chandler's influential 1939 novel. And you talk about pure Hollywood, an artistic metaphor is transformed into a literal structure at immense cost around which most of the third act revolves. And speaking of Chandler, he called Fearing's novel a tour de force. And as for the movie, the New York Times, which rarely raved about genre films, called The Big Clock a dandy clue chaser of the modern chromium-plated type. But it is also an entertainment which requires close attention from the start. It's a 17-jewel entertainment guaranteed to give a good, if not perfect, time. And though we try our best here at TCM, there is no way we could ever top this film's debut screening at Manhattan's Paramount Theater. The opening act that April night in 1948 was Duke Ellington and his orchestra with Ella Fitzgerald. All I can say is, ladies and gentlemen, let's take the A train uptown to watch The Big Clock.